It started with a drive. I had been planning this little retreat for months, and the plan was simple. Leave the city behind for a week, a secluded cabin deep in the mountains where there was no cell service, no internet, just me and the silence. I needed the isolation, a way to shut everything out and clear my head. The GPS had said I was more than an hour from the nearest small town, and the last 20 miles were on a rough, gravel road that twisted through thick pine forest. The trees pressed in from both sides, dark and silent, their shadows stretching long in the late afternoon sun. I had a sense that once I reached the cabin, the world I knew would shrink to just that small wooden structure and the forest surrounding it. The cabin appeared suddenly, as if it had been hiding behind the last curve of the road. It wasn't large, just a simple two-room structure made of rough-hewn logs, with a small porch that overlooked a clearing. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, and the windows reflected the fading sunlight. I parked my car in the small clearing, the gravel crunching beneath the tires, and for a moment I just sat there, listening to the wind moving through the pines. The isolation felt good, almost like a physical relief, but there was also a prickling unease I couldn't shake. The forest was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as if everything had gone still to watch me arrive. The first thing I did was unload my things. I had packed light a backpack, a small cooler with food, a sleeping bag, and some basic tools. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and something faintly musty, like it hadn't been used for months. Dust motes floated in the thin streams of sunlight coming through the windows. The furniture was minimal. A small table, 2 chairs, a metal-framed bed in the corner. There was a fireplace with a few logs stacked nearby and a rusty old wood stove. I set down my things and immediately noticed the lack of modern conveniences. No electricity, no running water. I had brought bottled water, a small solar lamp, and a camping stove, so I was prepared. I had chosen this place deliberately for its remoteness, but as I looked around the cabin, the isolation began to sink in more heavily than I expected. I spent the next hour exploring the cabin, making sure everything was in order. The windows all latched securely, the doors locked solidly from the inside. The forest outside felt dense and quiet, and I felt a slight chill despite the warm afternoon. I set my backpack on the floor, unpacked my food, and boiled water on the stove for tea. The sound of bubbling water was startlingly loud in the silence, each pop and hiss echoing against the log walls. I sat at the table, sipping my tea, listening. For a while, nothing happened. The quiet was comforting, but it also felt heavy, almost pressing in from the trees around the cabin. As the sun dropped lower, shadows stretched across the clearing. I decided to take a short walk around the perimeter, mostly to get a sense of the land. The forest pressed in closely, dense with pine and undergrowth. Every sound, my footsteps on dry leaves, the snap of a twig sounded exaggerated in the stillness. About 50 yards from the cabin, I saw an old, weathered trail that led deeper into the woods. I didn't plan to explore it tonight, but I noted it, realizing that this cabin had likely been used by hikers or hunters before. The thought made me uneasy, but I shook it off. I returned to the cabin as the sun sank completely, leaving only the deep blue of twilight. I lit the fireplace, the crackle of the flames filling the space with warmth and a small sense of security. I ate a simple meal, more out of habit than hunger, and spent the evening arranging my gear. It was when the night truly settled in that I felt it, the real weight of being alone. The forest was no longer a background. It became alive with sounds I hadn't noticed before. The distant rustle of branches, the call of a lone owl, the faint scratching that might have been a small animal or something else. I tried to convince myself it was normal, the sounds of nature at night, but a subtle anxiety had begun to crawl under my skin. Sleep came fitfully. Every crack of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the cabin walls jolted me awake. At some point, I became certain I had heard footsteps outside. Heavy, deliberate steps, not like the scurry of deer or raccoons. I told myself it was the wind or a branch falling, but my heart was racing, and I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. I lay there, eyes wide, listening to the night. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time seemed distorted, and finally, in the depth of darkness, I drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. The next day, I tried to ignore the fear. I told myself I was imagining things, that the forest was full of wildlife and the cabin's isolation made every noise seem amplified. I spent the day exploring more of the surrounding area, taking careful notes of the paths and the small creek that ran nearby. I collected firewood, making sure I had enough for several nights, and carefully secured the cabin. Yet, every time I looked into the forest, every time a shadow moved among the trees, my chest tightened. I kept reminding myself that people did live in remote areas, that this was not unusual, and yet my instincts screamed otherwise. That night, the feeling returned, stronger than before. It wasn't just the sense of being watched now. It was the certainty that someone or something had been near the cabin during the day. I had checked the perimeter thoroughly, but my mind played tricks, showing me movements in every dark patch of trees. Around midnight, I thought I heard someone walking along the far edge of the clearing. The steps were slow, deliberate, and they paused as if listening. My hands shook as I picked up the small hunting knife I had brought, though I knew it would do little against anything larger than me. I stayed by the window, peering into the darkness, straining to see movement among the trees, but the forest remained impossibly still. The following morning, I found signs. Small footprints in the mud near the cabin, too large to be a deer, not quite right for a human sneaker, but unmistakably a tread left by something that had walked there while I was asleep. My stomach sank. I realized I had to be careful. Whoever had been around the cabin could come back tonight. I spent the day boarding up the windows more securely, dragging extra logs in front of the cabin doors, and preparing my small solar lamp and food so I could remain in the cabin without going outside after dark. The sense of isolation became a heavy, physical thing. The forest that had seemed peaceful now felt like a trap, pressing in from all sides. I had planned the trip for months. It was supposed to be a simple escape from everything, a break from the noise and the weight of life in the city. The cabin was remote, a small wooden structure tucked deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. The listing had described it as quiet, isolated, perfect for someone who wanted to be alone with their thoughts. At the time, it sounded like exactly what I needed. I packed carefully, making sure I had enough food, water, and firewood for a few days. I even brought a small first aid kit, extra blankets, and a heavy-duty flashlight. I drove the long, winding roads out of town as the sun was dropping toward the horizon. And by the time I reached the forest's edge, the sky was streaked with pink and orange. I parked the car near the trailhead and carried my bags down the narrow path that led to the cabin. The forest was dense, and the trail was almost completely overgrown in places. The air was thick with the smell of damp leaves and moss, and the occasional bird call echoed strangely through the trees. I kept thinking about how alone I was, and at first it was calming. There was no one to bother me, no cars, no phones ringing, no deadlines. I felt free. The cabin finally appeared through a small clearing, and I was relieved to see that it was sturdy and intact. Its wooden walls were weathered but solid, the roof unbroken, the windows uncracked. A small stack of firewood sat neatly beside the door, and I felt a momentary sense of comfort. Inside, the cabin was simple but functional. A small kitchenette occupied one corner, with a wood-burning stove and a sink. The furniture was sparse. A wooden table, a few chairs, a couch, and a bed in the back corner. There was a single bathroom, small but clean. I set down my bags and started unpacking, feeling the tension of the drive start to slip away. I made a fire in the stove, appreciating the warmth immediately, and I settled into the couch with a cup of tea I had brought. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, but inside, it was quiet, safe. Night fell quickly. The forest seemed to close in around the cabin as darkness thickened. I kept a flashlight on the table beside me, but I didn't feel afraid yet. I had been alone before, even in the woods, and I thought I could handle it. I drifted off to sleep with the sound of the fire crackling. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound that made my heart stop. At first, I couldn't identify it. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like someone was moving outside. I froze, listening. The wind was calm now, and there were no animals close enough to make that sound. It was a dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the ground, muffled but deliberate. I stayed still, holding my breath, straining to hear more. Then there was a pause. The quiet stretched long enough that I started to think I had imagined it. I told myself it was a deer, or maybe a fallen branch being pushed by the wind. I went back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. When I woke in the morning, the forest looked peaceful again. The sun filtered through the trees in golden beams. The birds were singing, and the world seemed calm and normal. I convinced myself it had been nothing, a trick of the night. The next day, I tried to shake the tension by keeping busy. I gathered more firewood, cleaned the cabin, and explored the surrounding area. The forest seemed endless, with narrow paths winding between tall pines and thick underbrush. I noticed how quickly shadows moved as the sun shifted, how isolated everything felt. Even in daylight, there was a sense of remoteness that pressed against me. I kept telling myself it was just the forest, just the silence, nothing more. That night, the sounds returned. At first, I heard only a faint rustling, but then I caught it again. The dragging noise, slow and deliberate, coming from the far side of the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the window, shining it out into the darkness. Nothing. Only trees, only shadows. But the feeling of being watched was there, pressing against my skin, making my stomach churn. I tried to convince myself to ignore it, to stay calm, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, listening to every sound, my mind turning over possibilities I didn't want to consider. By the third day, my unease had grown into a constant tension. The forest felt alive in ways that were uncomfortable, almost suffocating. I heard branches snapping when no one should have been there, leaves rustling when no breeze moved through the trees. I started checking the locks on the doors repeatedly, inspecting the windows to make sure they were secure. I carried a knife with me now, not because I expected anything, but because the fear had taken root. I couldn't explain why, but I knew something was off. Late in the afternoon, I went to fetch more firewood from the far side of the clearing. The stack near the cabin was almost gone, and I wanted to be prepared for another long night. As I moved through the trees, I felt the forest close around me, and the sound of my own footsteps seemed too loud, too intrusive. That's when I saw it. A figure partially obscured by trees, moving slowly along the edge of the clearing. My first thought was that it was someone else staying in the area. That didn't make sense. There were no roads, no nearby cabins. Whoever it was, they shouldn't have been there. I froze. The figure didn't run, didn't wave. It just moved silently, keeping to the shadows, watching. I ran back to the cabin, my heart pounding, and locked the door behind me. I double-checked all the windows, all the locks. I called the ranger station on the cabin's emergency phone, but there was no answer. The forest was silent again, almost unnaturally so. I tried to keep calm, telling myself that it was probably just another hiker, lost or wandering. But deep down, I knew it had been something else, someone who shouldn't have been there. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. I kept the fire burning and the flashlight in my hand, ready for whatever might come. Around midnight, I heard scratching at the door. Not a branch or an animal, but deliberate, strong scratches, as if someone were testing the lock. I pressed myself against the wall, knife in hand, heart hammering. The sound lasted for several minutes, then stopped. Silence returned, but the fear didn't leave me. I knew I couldn't stay. At first light, I packed as quickly as I could. I didn't eat, didn't drink, just grabbed my things and prepared to leave. As I moved through the trees toward the car, I felt eyes on me again. Every rustle, every movement made my stomach twist. I didn't stop until I reached the car and locked myself inside. I started the engine and drove immediately back toward the highway, not looking back. The forest receded in the distance, but the memory of those nights stayed with me, heavy and constant. I reported the incident to the local authorities. They told me no one else had been reported in the area and that it was likely a transient or someone hiding in the woods. They increased patrols temporarily, and a week later, they found evidence of a small encampment near the clearing where the cabin stood. Tents, fire pits, and signs that someone had been living there for weeks or months watching the cabin. Nothing else was found. No confrontation. No physical harm done to anyone. But knowing that I had been so close to someone unknown, someone willing to linger just out of sight, changed everything. I returned home safely, and life slowly returned to normal, but I never went back to that cabin. I kept the photographs I had taken of the area, the stack of firewood, the small worn paths in the clearing, as reminders of how quickly solitude can become danger. I started carrying a larger knife on all trips, even in the city. I learned to notice sounds more carefully, to trust the sense of being watched. Most of all, I learned that the forest, as beautiful and quiet as it can be, hides more than just animals. It hides people who can slip through the shadows, and the thought of them out there, just beyond sight, is something I will never forget. It started on a quiet, cloudy afternoon in late autumn. I had driven for hours through winding mountain roads, past dense forests and small, abandoned settlements that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The air was crisp, with a faint smell of damp leaves and decaying wood. I was heading to a small cabin I had rented online, somewhere deep in the mountains, away from towns, cell service, and people. The pictures online made it look quaint and inviting, perched on the edge of a clearing with towering pines surrounding it. I told myself it would be peaceful, a perfect place to read, write, and clear my mind. I had no idea how wrong I would be. The last stretch of road was little more than gravel, with patches of mud and loose stones. I had to drive slowly, sometimes stopping to let branches scratch off the sides of my car or to move fallen twigs from the path. The sun was already lowering in the sky by the time I finally spotted the cabin. From a distance, it looked exactly like the picture, small, made of dark timber with a stone chimney and a porch that wrapped around the front. But up close, I noticed how weathered it was. The wood was cracked in places, moss growing along the edges of the roof, and some windows had a faint layer of dirt that made it hard to see inside. It wasn't abandoned, not really, but it had been neglected for a while. I parked near the porch and stepped out, feeling the cold air bite at my skin. The forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I could hear nothing human, no distant road, no animals larger than squirrels. Just silence, heavy and deep. I carried my bag and supplies inside. The cabin smelled of damp wood, dust, and something faintly metallic, like old pipes or iron. I ran my hand along the counters and tables, noticing the roughness of the wood, the small scratches and marks of years of use. I explored the cabin slowly. It had a living area with a fireplace, a small kitchen with basic appliances, a bedroom, and a bathroom. The electricity worked, though flickering lights suggested the wiring was old. There was a small pile of firewood stacked near the fireplace, which I immediately began to prepare. I didn't know why, but I felt a strange unease that I couldn't explain. Something about the way the cabin sat alone, the way the trees pressed close to the windows, made me feel like I wasn't just isolated. I was watched, even if I knew logically that there was no one there. Night came quickly. I lit the fire and settled into the living room with a blanket and a notebook. The wind picked up outside, shaking branches against the cabin walls and creating shadows that flickered in the firelight. I could hear the occasional crack of a branch breaking, small, sharp sounds that seemed to echo. I told myself it was normal, the forest reacting to the wind. I tried to focus on my writing, but every so often I would glance toward the window, expecting to see movement in the dark tree line, though there was never anything there. Around midnight, I started to notice strange noises, not outside but inside the cabin itself. At first, it was subtle, small creaks, as if the wood was shifting. I reminded myself that old cabins do that the cold air and temperature changes cause expansion and contraction. But then it got worse. I could hear the floorboards above me groaning under weight, though I was alone. I went upstairs slowly, my heart pounding, flashlight in hand, checking the empty bedroom and bathroom. Nothing, no one, but the sound continued, moving from room to room, heavy footsteps that weren't mine. I returned downstairs, shaking, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind, the house settling, my imagination. I lit more firewood and sat as close to the fireplace as I could. My mind raced with rational explanations, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I could feel it in the way the air seemed heavier. The shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. Then came the knocking, not on the door, but on the walls themselves, light, deliberate taps like someone testing them. I froze, listening, straining to hear the rhythm, trying to tell if it was random or intentional. Hours passed, and I tried to sleep in the bedroom. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined movement in the corners, felt the floorboards shift beneath the mattress. I woke to the sound of the porch door slamming. Heart in my throat, I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, only to see the heavy branches of the pine trees swaying in the wind. No sign of anyone, no footprints in the mud, nothing but the empty clearing. My mind raced, and I realized the isolation wasn't just a backdrop, it was a trap. If something happened, I was completely alone. By the next day, I decided to explore the perimeter of the cabin to reassure myself. The forest pressed in tight, thick undergrowth and uneven ground, making every step slow and deliberate. I noticed old tire tracks, faint but recently made, leading to the side of the property I hadn't seen from the road. Someone had been here recently. My stomach twisted. I went back to the cabin, locking doors and checking the windows. I told myself it was probably a neighbor or a hiker, nothing threatening. But that night, the noises returned. This time, it wasn't just creaks. I heard breathing, slow, deliberate, heavy breathing that seemed to come from outside the bedroom window. I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with a baseball bat I found in the corner, firewood stacked defensively around me. Every sound, every whisper of movement, set my nerves on edge. Hours passed like minutes, the weight of isolation pressing down on me. I started to notice small signs that someone or something had been inside. Scratches near the door frame, footprints in the dust on the porch, an empty can of food that hadn't been there before. Panic mixed with hyper-awareness. I stayed awake the entire night, listening, watching, my body tense. By morning, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, checking the doors and windows one last time. As I walked to the car, I noticed footprints in the mud leading into the trees. They weren't mine. They were recent. My hands shook as I drove back toward the main road, eyes darting to every shadow along the way. The sense of being watched never left me until I reached the first gas station. where cell service returned and the safety of other people became real. Weeks later, I returned to the area during daylight cautiously to inspect the cabin from a distance. The place looked empty, quiet. The tracks I had seen were gone, the area appearing normal. A neighbor, an older man who lived in the valley, told me the cabin had been abandoned before, but occasionally used by transient people looking for shelter. No one lived there, no one owned it actively. I realized what had happened. I had stumbled into a place that was isolated, unknown to me, occasionally visited by people who might not have had good intentions. My paranoia had been real, but not imaginary. I hadn't been alone. That experience changed how I viewed isolation. I understood, in a way I hadn't before, that being truly alone in the wilderness isn't just about quiet and peace, it's about vulnerability. I never returned to that cabin, but I learned to respect the limits of solitude. Being unprepared in a place like that isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. And the sense of being watched, even when no one is in sight, is a survival instinct tuned over millennia. The fear I felt was real, and it saved me from staying too long, from venturing too far. I carried that awareness with me, always checking doors, knowing the signs of intrusion, understanding that isolation can be deadly if ignored. I had been driving for hours, the tires of my old, beaten-down pickup crunching over the gravel road that led deeper into the forest than I had ever dared to go alone. The sun had started to dip below the thick, dark treeline, throwing long shadows across the narrow path. My destination was a small, remote cabin I had rented for the weekend. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape, a place where I could be completely alone and disconnect from the constant noise of life. I had seen pictures online, tiny, rustic, tucked away in a dense patch of pines, with a little stream running nearby, but nothing could prepare me for how isolated it actually felt. The road narrowed further, lined with trees so close together that their branches intertwined above, forming a natural tunnel. I could barely see the sky now, only faint strips of dusky pink and orange as the sun continued to fall. My truck's headlights pierced through the gloom, illuminating small rocks and puddles on the uneven ground. I could feel the tension in my shoulders rising with each passing mile. It wasn't fear exactly, just a kind of nervous awareness. I was alone, miles from any real help, and the silence around me was almost suffocating. Finally, the cabin appeared, almost hidden in the shadows. It was smaller than I expected, with weathered wooden walls, a tin roof with patches of rust, and a porch that sagged slightly under its own weight. The stream I had seen in the pictures was there, winding silently past the back of the cabin, reflecting the fading light in its smooth, cold surface. I parked the truck haphazardly near the porch and climbed out, the gravel crunching under my boots. The air smelled of damp pine and earth, strong and biting. My stomach twisted slightly at the realization of just how alone I was. The cabin door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, revealing the interior. It was dimly lit by the fading daylight filtering through dusty windows. Inside, the air was cold and smelled faintly of mildew and old wood. There was a small kitchen area, a wood-burning stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a bed tucked into one corner. Everything was simple, utilitarian. There was a stack of firewood in the corner and a lantern sitting on the table, its glass slightly cloudy. I set my bag down and took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. This was what I had wanted, solitude, but now that it was real, it felt heavier than I had imagined. I started a fire in the stove, listening to the crackle of wood as the flames took hold. It was comforting, the only sound that cut through the oppressive silence outside. The wind rustled the trees, sometimes sharply, like branches were scraping against each other, and I felt a twinge of unease every time I heard it. I told myself it was just the forest, nothing more, but the thought lingered. My first night passed slowly. I didn't sleep well. The creaking of the cabin, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustling of leaves all kept me half awake. I was hyper-aware of every sound, imagining threats around every corner. The next morning, I woke to overcast skies. A light drizzle had begun, and the trees around the cabin glistened with moisture. I made a small breakfast over the stove, the smell of frying bacon and coffee briefly masking the musty scent of the cabin. I knew I needed to explore a little, familiarize myself with the area, and make sure I wasn't completely lost if something went wrong. The forest was dense and uneven, with narrow paths barely visible among the undergrowth. I followed the stream upstream, careful of slippery rocks and mud, taking mental notes of landmarks, fallen trees, rocks with moss, a distinctive cluster of birch trees. Every few minutes, I would pause, listening. The forest seemed alive, every rustle of leaves or snapping twig amplified in the heavy, damp air. It wasn't until the third hour of wandering that I noticed something strange. There were signs that someone had been here recently. Footprints partially washed out by the rain but still visible in the soft earth. Not animal prints, human. They were fresh enough to make me pause, a chill crawling along my spine. I traced them slowly, trying to see where they led. They moved in no particular direction, sometimes near the stream, sometimes toward the thicker part of the woods. My imagination started running wild. Who could be this deep in the forest? Was it another hiker? Someone living off the grid? The thought made my chest tighten. Evening, I returned to the cabin, soaked and exhausted. I made a fire again, this time keeping it going longer. As darkness fell, the forest outside seemed to close in. The sound of the rain tapping on the tin roof was comforting, almost, until I noticed a faint noise, something moving outside. It wasn't the wind or rain. It was deliberate, slow, cautious steps approaching the cabin. My heart rate spiked. I stayed as still as I could, listening. The footsteps stopped near the porch, then shifted slightly, as if someone was circling. I didn't dare open the door. I tried to remind myself that this was probably a hiker or someone else in the area, but my rational mind didn't soothe the fear crawling over me. I spent the rest of the night sitting near the stove, fire burning high, my eyes darting to every shadow outside. The next morning, I decided I needed a plan. I couldn't stay passive. I had to take action to protect myself. I checked my supplies. A small pocket knife, matches, the lantern, food rations, and my backpack. Nothing that would make me feel entirely safe, but better than nothing. I also had my truck, which at least provided a potential escape route. I spent hours during the day exploring the surrounding perimeter, trying to figure out all the possible approaches to the cabin, mentally preparing for any situation. That night, I placed logs around the perimeter that could make noise if stepped on, and I kept a knife in my hand, lying awake listening for any movement outside. Days passed like this. I stayed mostly inside, rationing food, keeping the fire going, and checking the windows repeatedly. Sometimes I thought I saw figures moving in the shadows of the forest, and my breath would catch. The isolation started affecting me mentally. I became obsessive about sounds, every wind gust or distant crack of would making me jump. On the fourth night, the worst happened. I woke to the sound of a branch snapping close to the cabin. My heart thundered, and I strained my ears. The sound came again, followed by a low rustle outside the window. I grabbed the knife and lantern, careful not to make any sudden movements. The shadow outside seemed to pause, and I realized someone had reached the cabin, maybe even been watching me for hours. Panic surged, but I forced myself to think logically. There was only one thing to do: stay put, stay silent, and prepare to defend myself if needed. The night dragged on longer than any before. I kept the fire high, and every few minutes I would check outside. The figure, whoever it was, never tried to break in. By dawn, the shadow was gone, leaving only the remnants of broken branches and a faint set of footprints leading back into the forest. I was trembling, but I knew I had survived without direct confrontation. The relief was immense, but I also knew I couldn't stay any longer. I packed my essentials quickly, keeping an eye on the forest as I went. The drive back was nerve-wracking. Every sound outside the truck and animal, a fallen branch made me flinch. But eventually, the gravel road widened, signs of civilization appeared, and I felt an overwhelming sense of release. The ordeal was over. I never returned to that cabin, and I never explored that part of the forest again. The experience stayed with me, the relentless isolation, the feeling of being watched, the cold, damp nights. But I also carried a sense of clarity. That preparation, vigilance, and calm thinking were the only things that could keep me safe. That cabin, deep in the forest, had been terrifying, but it had taught me how to survive in a situation where fear was the only constant companion. I had faced the unknown and walked away, cautious, exhausted, but alive. I had been planning this trip for months. A week alone at a cabin deep in the woods, far from any road or town. I wanted complete isolation, a chance to escape the constant hum of city life and just exist with the silence of the forest. I packed carefully, enough food for a week, a first aid kit, a few spare blankets, a small propane stove, and my backpack full of basic tools: an axe, a knife, matches, a flashlight, and a lantern with extra fuel. I left my phone off, expecting no signal, which was exactly what I wanted. The cabin itself was small but solid, a simple wooden structure with a pitched roof, a stone fireplace, and a porch that looked over a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. It had been empty for months, and when I arrived, the smell of old wood and damp earth was strong. I walked around the cabin, inspecting the windows and doors. Everything seemed secure, though the wood groaned under my weight, old but sturdy. I could tell the previous occupant had left in a hurry. There were a few rusted nails on the porch, and inside, a thin layer of dust coated the floorboards. I set up my sleeping area in the back corner, rolled out my sleeping bag, and organized my supplies. I checked the stove and the lantern to make sure they worked, and then I went outside to gather firewood. The air was cool, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves and pine needles. The forest was silent except for the occasional distant call of a bird or the rustle of a small animal in the undergrowth. I collected dry branches and larger logs, dragging them back to the cabin and stacking them neatly beside the fireplace. The first night was peaceful. I made a small fire, sat on the floor near it, and ate a simple meal of canned beans and bread. I could hear the wind in the trees outside, the occasional snap of a twig from an animal, and I felt perfectly alone. The isolation was calming. I had expected some unease, some creeping fear, but I felt confident and prepared. I went to sleep early, exhausted from the drive and the work of settling in. The next day, I woke early, sunlight filtering through the gaps in the wooden walls. I spent the morning exploring the immediate area around the cabin, marking my path carefully so I could return without difficulty. I noticed a small creek a few hundred feet from the clearing, its water clear and cold. I decided to refill my water bottles from it using a portable filter. The forest was beautiful in the morning light. Sunlight slanted through the branches, creating patterns on the forest floor. I collected more firewood and inspected the cabin again, making minor repairs, tightening loose hinges, nailing a board that had partially come loose. It was during the afternoon that I first felt the unease. At first, it was subtle. I thought I heard the sound of someone walking near the edge of the clearing. I froze listening, but the sound didn't come again. I checked my surroundings carefully, scanning the trees, the undergrowth, and the path leading to the cabin. Nothing. I shook it off. There was no one here. No one could get here without a long hike. Still, I couldn't quite shake the feeling. Something about the forest seemed wrong. Not dangerous in a natural way, but wrong in the sense that it was too quiet, too still. Evening, I lit the fire again and cooked a small meal. The light of the flames made the shadows dance across the walls. I sat and stared into the fire, trying to distract myself from the uneasy feeling creeping along my spine. I went outside briefly to relieve myself and noticed that the forest seemed darker, the shadows thicker. Even though the moon was high, I felt a small pang of fear, the first real fear since arriving. I told myself it was just the isolation, just the natural fear of being completely alone in the woods. The third day, things escalated. I woke to the sound of snapping twigs. I immediately reached for my flashlight, then remembered I was alone. The cabin door was closed, the windows latched. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the clearing. Nothing. I walked around the perimeter, checking the forest line. Still nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I spent the day collecting firewood further out, making sure to stay alert. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. By evening, the feeling had intensified. I noticed something odd. One of the logs I had stacked earlier had been moved slightly. Not by much, but enough that I knew I hadn't done it. My stomach tightened. I walked around the clearing, examining the ground for footprints. The soil was soft, fallen leaves partially covering it, but there were no clear marks. Yet I couldn't ignore the evidence that something had been here. My mind ran through scenarios, each more terrifying than the last, and I realized with a cold clarity that someone or something had entered my space without my knowledge. I decided to stay vigilant that night. I slept lightly, keeping the knife under my pillow and the lantern at my side. Around midnight, I woke to a sound at the window, soft scratching, like someone testing the glass. My heart pounded in my chest. I shone the flashlight outside, but the clearing was empty. I strained to hear anything beyond the immediate area of the cabin, but all I could hear was the wind and the occasional rustle of animals. My mind raced with possibilities. Had someone followed me here? Was it a local trying to scare off intruders? Or someone more dangerous? The thought that I could be in the territory of someone armed and willing to harm me made my stomach turn. The next morning, I inspected the cabin thoroughly. I found evidence that someone had been inside overnight. A faint footprint in the dirt near the door. A branch moved against the side of the cabin. I knew I had to act cautiously. I spent the morning reinforcing the doors and windows, stacking firewood strategically to block the porch, and preparing a plan in case someone tried to enter again. I realized that this wasn't just fear of the forest. This was a real, tangible threat. I made a decision to leave the cabin for a short time to get a signal on my phone and contact someone. I packed a small bag with essentials, leaving the rest secured inside. I followed the small trail leading down from the cabin, keeping my senses alert. Every sound, twigs snapping, leaves brushing against each other, made me flinch. I walked fast but quietly, making sure to stay off the main path where someone could spot me. After an hour, I reached a higher clearing and finally had a weak signal. I called the local ranger station, explaining my location and the situation. They promised to send someone to check the area. By the time I returned to the cabin, late in the afternoon, a ranger was already there. He had a partner and a dog, and together they searched the clearing and surrounding forest. They found tracks leading from the main trail to the cabin, confirming my suspicion that someone had been following me. The rangers stayed the night to ensure I was safe. It was the first time I slept without fear since arriving. In the following days, I packed my belongings and left the cabin, not daring to stay longer. I returned to the city, shaken but safe, having learned the raw, chilling reality of complete isolation. There was no supernatural presence, no ghostly hauntings, just the terrifying possibility that someone else could be out there, watching, waiting. The fear I experienced was real, grounded in reality, and it stayed with me long after I returned home. I realized that the forest, beautiful and silent as it was, could conceal danger in ways I hadn't imagined. My time at the cabin was meant to be a peaceful retreat, but it had become a harsh lesson in caution, preparedness, and the unsettling truth that being alone in the wilderness can make you extremely vulnerable. I never returned to that cabin, and I never forgot the fear of being watched in the quiet woods, where every sound, no matter how small, could mean something far more dangerous than I wanted to imagine. I had always loved the quiet of the mountains. There was something about the way the wind moved through the pines, the distant rush of a stream, and the smell of damp earth that made me feel alive. That spring, I decided to rent a small cabin deep in the forest for a week. I wanted to be completely alone, away from the constant noise of the city and the never-ending responsibilities. The cabin was advertised as secluded, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense woods. When I arrived, I felt the tension in my shoulders release in a way that only silence can bring. The cabin itself was rustic, made of old timber, with a steep roof and a small porch. Inside, it was simple but functional. A small kitchen, a living area with a wood stove, a bedroom, and a bathroom with a shower that seemed to have weak water pressure. There was no cell service, which was exactly what I wanted. I spent the first few hours unpacking, lighting a fire, and listening to the forest settle around me. At night, the wind rustling through the trees sounded like whispers, but I told myself it was just the trees, nothing more. The first day passed slowly. I wandered around the area, taking photographs of the forest and sketching in my notebook. I found a small stream not far from the cabin and watched the water ripple over stones, trying to memorize every sound. I had packed enough food and supplies to last the week, and I had a first aid kit and extra blankets. Everything seemed perfect, but on the second night, things began to feel different. The wind picked up, and it carried a strange, metallic scent that I couldn't place. I had noticed footprints around the cabin that weren't mine. They seemed fresh, pressed deeply into the soil around the porch, leading off toward the woods. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a stray dog. Still, the prints seemed too human to be anything else. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, telling myself I was being paranoid, but sleep was difficult. Every little sound, the cracking of branches, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of a coyote, made my stomach tighten. The next day, I stayed inside, working on my sketches and reading by the fire. I avoided the forest trails. By evening, the weather turned colder, and rain began to patter against the roof. I lit the stove and tried to focus on my sketching, but my eyes kept wandering to the windows, watching for movement. Around dusk, I noticed that some of my supplies had been shifted slightly. A box of canned food was knocked over. A few cans rolled across the floor. I froze. I was certain I had placed everything carefully that morning. It couldn't have been the wind. The windows were closed, the door locked. A deep unease settled into my chest. I spent hours making sure the cabin was secure. I reinforced the doors with the heavy kitchen chair, piled extra blankets against the windows, and kept a large knife within reach. Every crack of thunder, every gust of wind, made me jump. I slept fitfully that night, waking multiple times to check the doors and windows. The third day brought a faint hope. The rain had stopped, and the sky cleared. I tried to go for a short walk, sticking close to the cabin. I wanted to convince myself that I wasn't imagining things. I walked slowly, listening for any unusual sounds, but the forest seemed quiet. When I returned, I found a note tucked under the doormat. It was crude, written in a hurried scrawl, and it said only, "I see you." My heart jumped into my throat. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. My first instinct was to leave immediately, but the dirt road was narrow and muddy from the rain, and I knew my car would be difficult to reach if the path had softened too much. The rational part of me insisted I stay put until morning, but fear gnawed at every nerve in my body. I spent the rest of the day barricading every entry point I could find. I moved furniture against the doors, tied heavy cords around the handles, and kept the stove fire burning constantly. Every shadow cast by the flickering flames made me flinch. When night fell, I sat on the floor in the corner of the living room, knife in hand, listening. That night, I heard footsteps on the porch. They were slow, deliberate, dragging slightly. I held my breath, pressed against the wall, and waited. Hours passed, but eventually, the steps faded, leaving only the sound of the wind. The fourth day, I realized I couldn't stay inside forever. I had to gather supplies from my car. I moved cautiously, checking the windows and doors repeatedly before stepping outside. The forest was still, but I felt eyes on me. Every time a branch snapped, I jumped, my heart pounding. I ran to the car, grabbed what I needed, and returned to the cabin without incident. But the fear lingered like a shadow. That night, the intrusions increased. I could hear faint scraping at the back door, something trying to pry it open. I had moved heavier furniture against that door, but the sound continued for hours. The wind howled outside, masking some of the noises, but not all. Couldn't sleep. I kept a constant watch, listening, knife in hand, ready to confront whoever was outside. On the fifth day, I realized I needed a plan. I couldn't survive a full week under constant threat like this. I began making an escape route, clearing a path from the cabin to a side trail I had noticed the first day. I packed essential items in my backpack: food, water, first aid kit, flashlight, extra batteries, and my sketchbook. I planned to leave at dawn, hoping the early morning light would give me cover and visibility. That night, I slept poorly, but I was determined to be ready. Just before dawn, I woke to the sound of someone moving inside the cabin. My heart froze. I had double-checked every door and window the night before. Whoever was inside must have been watching me. I moved silently to the kitchen, grabbed a heavy cast-iron pan, and crept toward the sound. The intruder was in the living room, rifling through my supplies. I could hear the shifting of cans, the scraping of furniture. My breath was shallow. I could feel the sweat running down my back. I had a choice: confront them or try to escape.
I chose escape.
I backed away slowly, staying low, and made my way to the side door I had prepared. I slipped outside into the wet grass, my shoes sinking slightly in the mud. The forest was dimly lit by the first rays of dawn, and I moved as silently as possible. Every step felt loud, every branch a potential alarm. I followed the path I had cleared, keeping low and moving quickly. I could hear movement behind me, distant, but unmistakable. They had realized I was leaving. I ran faster, heart hammering, adrenaline fueling me. The forest was thick, but I knew the trail. I stumbled over roots, scraped my hands on branches, but I didn't stop. I could hear the intruder breaking branches behind me, gaining ground. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I pushed forward. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the edge of the forest and beyond it, a small ranger station I had noticed on the map. I ran toward it, waving my arms, screaming, hoping someone would see me. I burst onto the clearing, breathless and shaking, and the ranger inside immediately called the authorities. The police arrived quickly, combing the area. They found signs of someone having been inside the cabin recently, but the intruder had fled. The officers told me the forest around the cabin was known for occasional trespassers and criminals using secluded areas to hide. They assured me that I was safe now, but the experience left a permanent mark. I spent the next few days recovering, sleeping in a hotel in town rather than returning to the cabin. The forest, once a place of peace, now felt dangerous and unpredictable. In the end, I learned a hard lesson about isolation. While solitude can be healing, it can also be dangerous if one is unprepared. I realized the importance of being vigilant, prepared, and aware of surroundings, even in places that feel safe. I never returned to that cabin, and I chose more populated areas for my next retreats, always carrying a plan for emergencies. I had been planning the cabin trip for months. It wasn't far from the city, just a few hours' drive into the woods, but far enough to feel like I was completely alone. I was tired of the noise, the constant hum of traffic, the endless chatter of people I didn't know and didn't really care about. I wanted quiet. I wanted isolation. I wanted something simple: trees, snow, and the occasional bird, the kind of emptiness that made a person notice themselves again. I left on a Friday afternoon, taking my small, reliable SUV packed with a sleeping bag, extra blankets, canned food, bottled water, and my backpack with essential gear. I didn't plan to be gone more than 4 days, and I wanted to be completely off the grid. No internet, no phone service beyond a small patch at the entrance of the dirt road. That was perfect. I drove through the suburbs, then the winding country roads, then the dirt path that eventually led to the cabin. It was not easy to find at first, and I had to pull over twice to check my map. Even with GPS, some of the turns were unmarked. Trees pressed close on both sides, their branches scratching against the car roof in the wind. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected. A single-story structure, dark wood, with a pitched roof covered in moss. It looked worn but sturdy. There was a small porch with a rocking chair covered in dust and spiderwebs. I parked my car to the side, stepped out, and felt the air hit me like a wall. It was colder than I expected for early October, but refreshing in a way I didn't anticipate. I carried my bags inside, setting them on the wooden floor, and walked through the small rooms. The main area had a fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, and a kitchen corner with an old stove. There were 2 bedrooms, one small, the other slightly larger. I chose the bigger one, mostly because it had a better view of the surrounding forest. I unpacked, made some instant coffee, and sat by the window staring at the trees. They were tall, densely packed, the kind that made sunlight barely touch the ground. The wind shook them lightly, and I could hear the distant rustling of leaves, the occasional snapping of a branch. I felt calm at first, more relaxed than I had in months. I tried not to think about the quiet being too complete, the kind of quiet where every small sound feels amplified, like footsteps in a hallway when you're alone. I told myself I was just being silly. Night fell quickly. I lit the fireplace, the logs cracking and hissing as the flames licked the room. The shadows stretched along the walls, and I noticed the corners of the room seemed darker than they should be. I shook it off. Cabin lighting can be deceptive, I thought. The temperature dropped, so I wrapped myself in blankets and read for a while, the small oil lamp on the table casting a warm circle of light around me. Outside, the wind picked up. It was one of those steady gusts that make the trees bend and groan, but not violently. I listened to it for a long time, noticing the smaller sounds beneath it, the skittering of small animals, perhaps squirrels, the faint snap of twigs under some heavier weight, maybe a deer. I tried not to think about the fact that no one else was there for miles. Around midnight, I decided to check the cabin one more time before going to sleep. I turned off the lamp, stepped outside on the porch, and the cold air hit my face. The sky was overcast, so no stars, just darkness pressing down. I tried to trace the familiar path to the car, thinking maybe I'd see something. That's when I noticed the tracks. They weren't mine. Fresh footprints pressed into the damp ground, small but definite, leading toward the cabin from the woods. My stomach tightened, I told myself it could be a deer or a wild animal, but then I saw the spacing and the shape. Human. Someone had walked right toward the cabin. I went back inside, closed and locked the door, double-checked the windows. My hands were trembling slightly. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had been exploring the woods earlier that day and hadn't realized anyone lived there. Maybe it was hunters. But the isolation of the place made it impossible for me to ignore the possibility that someone had been watching the cabin. My logical brain argued with my fear, but neither side could fully convince me. I told myself to sleep and not dwell on it. Sleep didn't come easily. Every small noise startled me. The wind against the cabin walls, the creak of the wooden floor, even the dripping of water from the roof. At some point, I drifted in and out, barely noticing the hours passing. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a sound I could not ignore. The door, the front door of the cabin. Someone was trying to open it. Not forcefully, just enough to test the locks. My heart stopped. I lay still, trying to listen, trying to decide if I should move. I could hear the faint scraping of the lock, the low whisper of the wind, and the slight shuffle of footsteps on the porch. I realized I had to act. Slowly, I reached for the kitchen knife I had left on the table. My hands shook so badly I dropped it once before catching it. I didn't dare make a sound, just waited. After a few minutes, the movements outside stopped. I held my breath, listening. Then nothing. Silence again. My pulse was loud in my ears. Morning came gray and cold. I didn't sleep well. The cabin felt different now, more vulnerable, less like a haven and more like a trap. I went outside carefully, scanning the ground for tracks. The footprints were still there, leading toward the cabin and then back into the forest. I followed them a little ways, noting that they disappeared near a small rise. Whoever had been there hadn't gone far, but they had been close. I decided I had to leave. The fear had changed from abstract to urgent. I packed my things quietly, trying not to make noise. I didn't want to give anyone the chance to notice me if they were still nearby. The forest seemed thicker, more oppressive in the daylight than it had at night. The drive back was tense. Every rustle of leaves, every movement along the roadside made me flinch. I kept the doors locked, the windows up, and my senses sharp. By the time I returned to the main road, relief washed over me, but I didn't let it linger. I went straight home, showered, and locked every door and window. For the next week, I could not stop thinking about what had happened. I kept replaying the footprints in my mind, wondering who had come so close, why they hadn't made contact, and what they might have done if I had been alone without the ability to protect myself. I realized that the fear had been more than just the presence of someone else. It was the reminder of how vulnerable I was, how quickly isolation can turn from peaceful to dangerous. Weeks later, I returned to the area, but I didn't go to the cabin. I drove past the dirt road entrance and looked for tracks, signs of human presence. Anything. The cabin was empty, quiet, still standing, but I never felt the same draw to it. I had thought I wanted isolation, but now I understood that solitude carries its own risks, and the idea of being completely cut off is far more dangerous than I had imagined. In the end, I learned a lot from that trip. I learned to respect my surroundings, to be aware that the world is not always empty just because I want it to be. I learned the importance of preparation, of thinking about safety even in places that feel safe. Most importantly, I learned that fear is not always irrational. It is often a warning. And sometimes the best decision is to listen to it. I never returned to that cabin. Instead, I found other places to get away from the city, safer places where solitude didn't come with the possibility of unseen danger. And though I missed the quiet, the deep, perfect silence, I knew that peace meant little if it came with risk. I had been planning this solo cabin trip for months. I wanted a break from the constant hum of the city, the endless notifications, and the crowded streets. My cabin was in a remote part of the mountains, reachable only by a long stretch of dirt road that twisted and climbed through dense forest. I drove there with my car packed full of supplies: food, water, camping gear, a first aid kit, and a basic set of tools. The journey itself was exhausting, winding through steep slopes and thick trees, but I was determined to get some peace and quiet. The cabin appeared gradually through the trees, a small wooden structure with a single chimney and a covered porch. From the outside, it looked older than it probably was, the wood slightly weathered and moss growing in the cracks. I parked the car on the uneven ground near the front door and took a long look around. The silence was remarkable. There were no birds singing, no rustling of small animals, just the quiet crunch of my boots on the gravel and the wind moving through the treetops. Inside, the cabin was rustic but livable. A small kitchen area with a gas stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a wood-burning fireplace dominated the main room. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom with a single bed and a tiny bathroom. There was a sense of isolation that made my stomach twist in an uneasy way, but I told myself it was exactly why I had come. I unpacked my things, set up the small stove, and prepared a simple meal. The first night was uneventful, the kind of quiet that feels comforting when you're expecting it. I woke early the next morning, around 6, and the air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. I decided to explore the immediate surroundings before settling in for a day of reading and writing. The cabin sat near a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods. I walked for nearly an hour, taking in the thick undergrowth, the towering trees, and the occasional distant snap of a branch. Everything seemed normal, though I noticed that the forest felt dense and strangely unwelcoming, as if the sunlight itself had trouble reaching the ground. Returning to the cabin, I found the air inside slightly colder than when I had left. I chalked it up to the fact that the fireplace hadn't been lit overnight. I started a small fire, the crackling sound filling the quiet room, and prepared for another day of solitude. Around midday, I stepped outside to gather some firewood. The forest floor was damp and slippery, and I had to watch my footing carefully. As I bent to pick up a log, I thought I heard a sound, a branch breaking, just a little too deliberate to be random. I froze and listened, but the only response was the wind through the pines. Still, a shiver ran down my spine. That night, the feeling of being watched became more pronounced. Every creak of the wooden cabin, every gust of wind hitting the windows, felt amplified. I tried to focus on reading, but my eyes kept darting to the dark corners of the room. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a faint knock on the cabin door. My heart jumped violently, and I sat frozen, listening. Another knock, slightly louder. I told myself it must be an animal, probably a raccoon or a deer, but the pattern seemed too deliberate. I stayed silent for what felt like hours, and eventually, the knocking stopped. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining every possible scenario. The next day, I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin more thoroughly. I wanted to make sure nothing had been tampered with. As I walked around the back, I noticed something odd. Footprints in the damp soil, leading from the tree line directly to the cabin. They were large, human-like, and unmistakable. My stomach sank. I hadn't seen anyone else on the road, and no one had access to this isolated location unless they knew exactly where to come. My first thought was to pack up and leave immediately, but the car was half buried in mud from the previous day's rain, and I realized I might not get it moving without some effort. I spent the day trying to stay busy, collecting firewood, stacking supplies, and keeping a constant watch on the windows. By evening, I noticed the sun setting behind the mountains, the forest transforming into shadowed shapes that seemed to watch me back. I cooked a quick meal, eating hastily so I could get ready for the night. As darkness fell, I reinforced the door with the broom I had found in the cabin and placed a heavy chair against it. Every creak in the cabin made me tense. Around 10, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I crouched low, heart hammering, listening. The footsteps stopped outside the front door. I held my breath, clutching a small hunting knife I had brought with me. Time stretched, every second like a minute. Then I heard something move toward the back door. I didn't want to turn around, but instinct forced me to. In the dim light of the moon filtering through the windows, I saw the shadow of a figure at the back of the cabin. My stomach dropped. I could see nothing clearly, but I could tell it was human. My mind raced through every possible outcome. I couldn't run, the car was stuck, and I had no cell signal. I remembered the emergency flare I had brought. I fumbled in my backpack, my hands shaking violently, and managed to ignite it. The bright red light flared up, illuminating the cabin and the surrounding trees. The figure froze, then bolted into the forest. I could hear it moving quickly through the underbrush, and for the first time since I had arrived, I felt the full weight of isolation. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching the flare gun and knife, listening to the forest. The following morning, I decided to leave immediately. I tried the car, pushing and rocking it, and after nearly an hour of effort, it finally came loose. As I drove down the dirt road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. The road twisted and turned through the mountains, and I drove as fast as the conditions allowed, alert for any sign of pursuit. When I finally reached the main road, my relief was overwhelming. I called the local authorities as soon as I had cell signal, reporting the footprints and the attempted intrusion. They promised to investigate, though I knew the isolation made it unlikely they would find anything. Weeks later, I returned to the city, still shaken but relieved. I realized the experience had changed me, made me more cautious, more aware of how fragile safety can be in isolated places. I never returned to that cabin, and I avoided remote locations for a long time. The memory stayed with me, vivid in every detail: the quiet, the shadows, the sound of deliberate footsteps just outside the door. But I also learned to trust my instincts, to prepare for the worst, and to value the safety and normalcy of daily life. In the end, I survived, and that survival brought clarity. The wilderness is beautiful, but it is also indifferent, and sometimes danger can emerge in the most ordinary of forms. I had been planning the trip for months, trying to escape the chaos of the city and the endless pressure of work. I needed solitude, something quiet, something that would let me think and breathe. I found a cabin through a small, private listing, far off any main roads, deep in the woods. The pictures looked simple, rustic, and perfect. A small wooden cabin with a stone chimney, a porch that overlooked a clearing surrounded by dense trees. It was exactly what I needed. I drove for hours on a winding road that disappeared into nothing, the map only showing faint lines for the last stretches. The forest pressed in on both sides of the road, and by the time I reached the gravel path leading to the cabin, the sun was already low, painting the sky in muted shades of orange and gray. The cabin itself looked smaller in person, but sturdier. The woods smelled faintly of pine, and there was a slight dampness to the air that made the forest seem alive. I parked my car near the porch and stepped out, feeling the quiet. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, making every small sound: leaves brushing together, twigs snapping underfoot seem louder than it should. The cabin door creaked as I opened it, and I was greeted by a smell of wood and old earth. Dust floated in the light from the windows, and a faint chill ran through me. I dropped my bag near the door and walked through the small living area. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and the furniture was minimal. A couch, a wooden table, 2 chairs. The kitchen was tiny, with a small stove, a sink, and a few cabinets that smelled faintly musty. I opened one, half expecting to find old food, but it was empty except for a few plates. I spent the first hour exploring. There were 2 bedrooms, each with a bed covered in heavy blankets, and a small bathroom with a shower that seemed old but functional. The cabin had no internet, no cell service, nothing but the woods around it. For a moment, I felt a strange thrill. This was what I wanted. Isolation, a chance to be completely alone. I built a small fire in the fireplace, the first crackle of flames sending smoke curling up the chimney. I sat on the couch, listening to the forest breathe outside, feeling a sense of calm settle over me. The first night was mostly uneventful, but as I lay in bed, I noticed the sounds of the forest were different here. There was a rustling, soft but persistent, that seemed too deliberate to be normal. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, the animals moving through the underbrush. I had heard of deer and smaller predators like foxes in the area, but the sound continued, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, never stopping. I forced myself to sleep, and eventually I did, though my dreams were restless, filled with the sounds of branches snapping and leaves shifting, as if something was moving just out of sight. Morning came, and the forest looked innocent again in the daylight. I stepped outside and took a long walk, following a narrow path I hadn't noticed the night before. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. Birds called somewhere above, and sunlight filtered through the canopy. Everything seemed peaceful, normal. I told myself that the noises from last night were just that. Noises. The forest had sounds. I moved further along the path, noting how dense the trees became, the underbrush thick enough to make walking difficult. I spotted a small stream, the water clear and cold, running over smooth stones. I bent down and took a sip, the cold water shocking me awake, and I followed the stream for a while. Returning to the cabin, I decided to settle in for the day. I unpacked a few supplies, organized the kitchen, and prepared a small fire to cook on. By mid-afternoon, I had finished my tasks and sat back, listening again. The forest was quieter than usual, almost unnaturally so. I noticed the subtle shift in sounds. The wind had died down, the birds had gone silent, and there was a tension in the air I couldn't place. Something felt off. That night, the noises returned, louder this time. At first, it was just scratching against the side of the cabin. I assumed it was a raccoon or a deer brushing against the logs. But then there were thuds, heavy and deliberate, moving around the cabin in a pattern that didn't make sense for animals. I stayed on the couch, fire lit, eyes darting to the windows. I told myself it was probably a large animal, maybe a bear. The thought made my stomach tighten. Hours passed, and the noises stopped, but the feeling of being watched remained. I couldn't sleep, my mind running through every possibility. I tried to convince myself that nothing could get into the cabin without me hearing it, but the thought didn't comfort me. I stayed awake, listening, my eyes fixed on the window that overlooked the clearing. Somewhere in the woods, something was moving, and I couldn't tell if it was animal or human. The next day, I explored further. I stayed on the paths, careful not to venture too deep into the forest. I noticed subtle signs of someone or something being around. Footprints that weren't mine, flattened patches of grass, a branch broken in a strange way. I started feeling increasingly uneasy. The isolation that had felt freeing before now felt oppressive. Every shadow seemed heavier, every rustle more significant. I went back to the cabin, deciding to stay close to it, and spent the afternoon checking locks, reinforcing the doors, making sure nothing could enter easily. As the second night fell, the noises intensified. It started with scraping at the door, then heavy footsteps around the perimeter, thumping against the porch, moving in and out of the shadows. I could feel my heart pounding, every instinct screaming at me that I wasn't alone. I stayed on the couch, holding a heavy flashlight in one hand, an old hunting knife I had brought with me in the other. The fire was low, and the darkness outside seemed to press against the windows. Suddenly, there was a crash. Something had thrown itself against the door. The wood groaned under the impact. I scrambled back, knife in hand, trying to calm my breathing. I realized then that whatever was out there wasn't an animal. It moved with intent, testing, looking, trying to find a weakness. Panic rose in me, and I ran to the back of the cabin, checking the windows. They were all locked. I ran to the side entrance and barricaded it with a heavy chair, then to the front, doing the same. I could hear heavy breathing now, low and controlled, coming from all around. Hours passed. I stayed crouched behind furniture, listening to every sound. Occasionally, something would scrape or thump against the cabin, and I would hold my breath until it passed. The forest seemed alive, but this life felt predatory, calculated. I realized that whoever or whatever was outside, they were patient. They didn't need to rush. They could wait, and I had no way of calling for help. By the early hours of the morning, the sounds finally faded. I didn't sleep. The forest seemed calm again, but I knew better. I spent the next day preparing to leave. I packed everything quickly, throwing supplies into my bag. I didn't eat, didn't bother with fire or cooking. I was focused entirely on getting out. As I stepped outside, the air seemed to hold a weight. I walked briskly to my car, checking the trees and underbrush for movement, my ears straining for any sign of pursuit. I reached the gravel road and started the car. The engine roared to life, and I drove away without looking back. As the forest fell behind me, I realized how lucky I was to leave without confrontation. Later, I learned from a local ranger that the area had reports of poachers and trespassers who watched cabins for days, sometimes taking supplies, sometimes waiting for opportunities. I had been an easy target, alone, unprepared, and isolated. The thought made my stomach turn, but it also made me grateful. I had survived, and I had learned something important about preparation, instincts, and the quiet danger of being alone in the wild. I never returned to that cabin. Months later, I rented a cabin in a more populated area, near other cabins, with clear roads and neighbors within sight. I still love the forest, still love the quiet, but I now understand that nature is not always peaceful, and solitude can be dangerous. I had always loved the idea of being alone in the wilderness, surrounded only by the sounds of nature and the smell of the forest. It was supposed to be peaceful, a break from the noise of city life, a chance to breathe without the constant buzz of traffic and people. I had planned this trip for months, checking weather reports, mapping trails, and making sure my backpack was stocked with food, water, a first aid kit, extra clothes, and a flashlight with enough batteries to last me several days. The cabin I was renting was tucked deep into the woods, far enough from any road that it could only be reached by a rough dirt path. The pictures online had made it look cozy. A small, rustic cabin with a stone chimney, a porch that wrapped around two sides, and large windows that looked out over a dense forest. It seemed perfect. The drive to the trailhead was longer than I expected. The sun was already low when I parked my car on the side of a narrow dirt road, the kind of road where even one wrong turn could leave you stuck in mud or sand. I strapped on my backpack, checked my map again, and started walking. The forest was thick, the trees tall and close together, their trunks rough under my fingertips when I brushed past them. Birds flew overhead, and the occasional squirrel darted from branch to branch. For a while, I felt exhilarated, the kind of joy that comes from walking alone through a place where very few people go. I felt capable, strong, self-sufficient. The trail quickly narrowed. Roots and rocks made the ground uneven, and every step had to be careful. I was carrying more than I would have liked, but I needed the supplies, and the thought of spending a night without them was unacceptable. The cabin was supposed to be just a few miles in, but after an hour of hiking, I realized I hadn't seen a single marker. The trees looked the same. I could feel the sun slipping lower, and shadows stretched across the ground. I tried to follow the path I thought was correct, but it twisted unexpectedly, and soon I was not sure where I was. Panic began to creep in. I stopped, tried to breathe, and checked my phone for GPS. No signal. That wasn't unusual in the deep forest, but it made me realize how isolated I truly was. I had to trust my memory, my map, and the trail itself. I kept walking. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw it. The cabin appeared through the trees, just as the sun touched the horizon. Relief hit me like a wave, and I hurried forward. The porch was empty, the wood worn but sturdy. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and let my pack drop to the floor. The inside smelled of old wood and faint smoke. A small fireplace was against the far wall, a table with a couple of chairs in the middle of the room, and a bed tucked into a corner. Everything was simple, clean, but the isolation of it made my stomach tighten. This place was alone in the world, and tonight, I would be completely alone within it. I lit a small fire, unpacked my food, and ate quietly. Outside, the forest was darkening, and I could hear the distant sound of a creek and the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush. I tried to shake off a creeping unease. It was just being alone, I told myself, just the wilderness. I reminded myself that the cabin was solid, the doors and windows locked, and I had plenty of supplies. There was nothing to be afraid of. Night fell fully. The fire dwindled to glowing embers, and I wrapped myself in a blanket on the couch. I listened to the forest. Every sound was amplified in the darkness. A branch snapped somewhere far off, and my heart jumped. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a raccoon, but then a noise came closer, sliding, dragging, like something heavy being pulled along the ground. I froze, straining to hear. It stopped. I waited, holding my breath. My flashlight sat on the table, and I debated picking it up. But the battery was old, and I didn't want to waste it unless I had to. I convinced myself it was my imagination, a combination of nerves and the forest. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but every time a sound came, wind rattling a branch against the cabin, the creek rushing, something moving outside, I flinched. I kept imagining shapes outside the window, glimpses of movement in the corner of my eyes. Every little noise seemed magnified. Around midnight, I heard it again, but this time it was unmistakable. A crunch of gravel, then the thump of something heavy against the porch. I bolted upright, heart pounding. Whoever or whatever it was had found the cabin. I grabbed my backpack and started checking the locks. All of them were secure, but the noise didn't stop. It moved along the perimeter, hitting the wood in uneven bursts. I wanted to call for help, but no signal. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and no one would be driving by at this hour. I was trapped. Adrenaline took over. I grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet from the kitchen, moving slowly to the window. Peering outside, the darkness was almost complete, but I could see the outline of a person or something that looked like one moving along the porch. My mind raced. Who would be here? Why? The cabin wasn't well known. It wasn't advertised for public camping. I had found it through a rental site, obscure and private. This shouldn't be happening. I tried to calm myself, to think clearly. The person or people outside could be anyone. A local hunter, someone who had lost their way, or worse. I needed a plan. The fireplace poker was on the stand, and the kitchen knife was sharp and heavy. I moved them close. I stayed near the window, watching, listening, breathing quietly. The noise continued, then stopped again. Long minutes passed. I tried not to make a sound. Then, I realized the front door handle was rattling. Someone was trying it. My heart felt like it would explode. I grabbed the skillet, ready to swing, but also ready to retreat into the bedroom where I could lock the door. Suddenly, the handle stopped moving. Silence. I didn't move for what felt like hours, listening to my own ragged breathing and the sound of my heart in my ears. Eventually, the faint light of dawn began to pierce the darkness. I peeked outside. The porch was empty. No footprints, no sign of anyone. I stepped out cautiously. The ground was soft with dew. The forest beyond was quiet, almost serene. Whoever had been there was gone. I didn't know if they had left quietly, or if I had imagined part of it, or if they had been watching me from the trees, waiting. I didn't stay another night. I packed everything quickly and retraced my steps, moving as fast as possible along the trail, keeping my eyes open in all directions. Every shadow looked threatening. Every sound made me jump. But eventually I reached the dirt road, my car, my safety. The relief was overwhelming. I locked the cabin in my mind behind me, promising never to return. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. The forest, the silence, the weight of being completely alone with someone or something watching. I learned a lesson about solitude, about preparation, and about how vulnerable we can be when the world falls away around us. Even in a place meant to be peaceful, fear can live quietly, waiting. I don't know who or what it was, but I know I never want to find out. I made a decision that day to stick to more populated areas, to cabins near roads, to places where help is close. And while I'll always love the idea of the forest, I now understand that there is a thin line between adventure and danger, and crossing it alone can bring consequences you are not ready for. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea of spending a week alone in a remote cabin, far from cell service and the constant noise of the city, had felt like a sanctuary when life in town became overwhelming. I had stumbled upon the listing for the cabin online, a small, weathered wooden structure tucked deep into a forest along the edge of a lake. The photos were modest but charming. A mossy roof, a stone chimney, and a wooden dock stretching into the water. There was something undeniably peaceful about it. I imagined myself sitting on the porch, watching the mist rise off the lake in the early morning, sipping coffee as birds called to one another. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already leaning low in the sky. The drive up the narrow dirt road had taken longer than expected, the map promising a straight route but reality presenting twists, potholes, and thick overgrowth on either side. By the time I reached the cabin, the forest had swallowed the light. I parked my car on a patch of flattened grass near the cabin, the engine's hum fading to silence. The air was heavy, filled with the scent of wet pine needles and damp earth. The cabin itself was sturdily built but aged. The wood of the exterior had grayed, softened by years of rain and wind, and small cracks ran along the foundation. The door opened with a groan, revealing a small interior that smelled faintly of smoke and mildew. I had packed minimally, just a few days' worth of food, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a heavy wool blanket. The cabin had a small wood stove, and I set to work stacking a pile of firewood beside it. I lit the fire, the flames snapping and hissing as they caught on the dry kindling, filling the cabin with warmth and light. Outside, the forest seemed alive. Every sound was amplified in the stillness: the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a crow, the splash of something in the lake. As the darkness deepened, shadows from the trees fell across the cabin walls. I told myself I was imagining things, that the forest had always been like this, quiet, intense, and unyielding. But there was a weight in the air, a sense of being watched, that I could not shake. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on small tasks. Arranging my food supplies, checking the wood for the stove, making a simple dinner of canned soup heated over the fire. The cabin was cramped but functional, with a small bed in one corner, a wooden table, and a few shelves lined with old books and some dishes. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin settling in the cold. Night came fully, thick and suffocating. I closed the curtains and sat by the fire, feeling the warmth on my skin. The forest outside became a shifting black mass, leaves and branches moving with the wind, casting strange, fleeting shapes against the walls. I tried to read, but my eyes kept flicking to the window, to the dark beyond. I was aware of every little sound: the scuttling of an animal, a branch snapping, the water lapping at the shore. The isolation that had drawn me here now felt oppressive. Around midnight, I heard it. A slow, deliberate crunch on the gravel outside the cabin. My heart jumped, and I froze, straining to hear. Another crunch followed, then silence. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a raccoon, or even the wind dislodging something from the trees. But the sound had been measured, too deliberate to be an animal. My flashlight lay across the table, and I debated whether to pick it up. My rational mind urged me not to panic, but instinct had my hands shaking as I gripped it, sweeping the beam across the darkness beyond the window. Nothing moved, nothing appeared. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but sleep did not come easily. Every creak and groan of the cabin seemed louder now, sharper, as if the walls themselves were listening. I spent hours lying awake, listening to the night. At some point, I must have drifted off because I awoke to a different sound, the faint tapping on the window pane. I sat up instantly, my pulse racing. The window was just a single pane of glass, with a thin curtain partially drawn. The sound continued, irregular, faint, like someone testing the glass. I held my breath, straining to see in the dark. The flashlight on the table was just out of reach, and every instinct screamed that I should not move. After a long moment, the tapping stopped. I waited, silent and tense, until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the trees. By morning, I was exhausted, but the reality of the situation hit me with fresh clarity. Someone or something had been outside. The tracks in the soft earth confirmed it. They were human footprints, not animal, circling the cabin, stopping at each window as if inspecting the interior. My stomach churned. I realized I had left the door unlocked last night, thinking nothing would happen. The idea that someone had been watching me while I slept made my skin crawl. I considered leaving immediately, but the car was at the end of the narrow track, and panic could make the drive dangerous on the uneven road. Instead, I decided to stay alert, to take precautions. I secured the doors and windows as best I could, piled firewood against the main entrance as a barrier, and kept the flashlight in my hand at all times. The day passed slowly, each rustle of leaves outside setting my nerves on edge. I stayed inside, only venturing briefly to collect water from a small stream nearby, keeping my eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Each step I took felt loud, echoing in the stillness. By nightfall, I was tense but resolved to keep watch. Night came again, darker and heavier than the previous. I kept the fire alive, the orange glow providing a small island of safety in the surrounding darkness. Hours passed. Around midnight, I heard movement again, this time at the edge of the forest. A shadow flitted past, quick and deliberate. My breath caught. I thought about calling the police, but there was no signal here, and shouting would only give away my position. I realized I had to take action to protect myself. I remembered the axe I had brought for chopping firewood. It was heavy but usable. I positioned myself near the door, the firelight casting long shadows across the cabin interior. The tapping started again, slow and methodical, at the main door this time. I gripped the axe tightly, my knuckles white. Then silence. I waited, tense and silent, until the first signs of dawn began to break. Exhausted, I made a plan. I could not stay another night like this. I packed a small bag with essentials: water, food, the axe, a flashlight, and left through the back door, sticking to the tree line. My plan was to reach the road where I could see the car, avoiding the main path where anyone could be waiting. I moved cautiously, listening for any signs of pursuit. The forest seemed aware of me, each step a challenge. After an hour of slow, careful movement, I reached the dirt road. My car was there, seemingly untouched. Relief washed over me, but I remained vigilant as I approached, scanning the forest edges. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The drive back was tense, every shadow along the road causing my heart to jump. I kept the windows up, the doors locked, and drove until I reached a small town with phone service. I called the police, who came to investigate. They found nothing in the forest, no one hiding, no trace beyond the footprints I had seen. I realized that whoever had been watching me had vanished into the woods, leaving no trace, their intentions unknown. In the following days, I reviewed what had happened repeatedly in my mind. The fear, the isolation, the sense of being hunted. It was a sobering reminder that the forest, though beautiful, was not a safe haven. I realized the importance of preparation, awareness, and self-protection. The experience left me shaken, but also more vigilant and aware of my surroundings. Eventually, life returned to normal. I avoided cabins in the deep woods for a long time, and when I did return, it was always in areas that were secure, familiar, and never completely isolated. The memory of that week stayed with me: the sounds in the night, the prints in the dirt, the suffocating sense of being watched. I had survived, yes, but the forest had left a mark on me, one that reminded me that danger is often quiet, subtle, and always closer than we imagine. I had been planning this trip for months, thinking about it every day, and the moment finally arrived. The cabin was supposed to be remote, deep in the forest, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. I had grown tired of the noise of the city, the constant hum of cars, and the flickering lights that never seemed to stop. I wanted to disappear for a while, to be alone, and to test myself in solitude. The drive to the cabin took longer than I expected, the asphalt fading into a dirt road that twisted through dense forest, tall pines shading the path so completely that it felt like I had entered another world. By the time I reached the small wooden bridge that led to the cabin's driveway, the sky was already tinged with orange and pink from the sunset, casting long shadows through the forest. The cabin itself was nothing extravagant. It was made of rough timber, the kind that had been weathered by years of snow, rain, and sun. There was a small porch with a rusted railing, and a stack of firewood neatly piled against one side of the wall. The windows were dusty, and I had to wipe them to see inside. The interior smelled faintly of wood, dampness, and the lingering traces of past occupants. There was a small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, a bedroom, and a bathroom. Everything was simple, functional, but clean enough. I set my bag down and took a moment to look around. I had brought a few essentials: a sleeping bag, canned food, a water filter, a lantern, and a small first aid kit. I had also brought a rifle, not because I expected trouble, but because the forest could be dangerous. Bears, mountain lions, or even just falling into a ravine could turn a quiet retreat into a nightmare. I checked the rifle carefully, cleaned it, and then set it by the bed, where it would be within reach. The first night was calm. I lit a fire in the fireplace, letting the flames crackle and fill the room with warmth. Outside, the forest was dark and silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans warmed over the fire and then stretched out on the bed. I slept with the window slightly open, wanting to hear the sounds of the forest, to feel like I was really there and not just imagining it. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The cabin was near a small creek, its water clear and fast-moving. I followed it upstream, my boots squelching in the mud, careful not to slip on the wet rocks. The forest was dense, almost claustrophobic, but beautiful. Sunlight broke through in scattered beams, illuminating patches of moss and the occasional wildflower. As I walked, I kept an eye out for animal tracks, noticing deer prints and smaller tracks that might belong to raccoons or foxes. Everything felt normal, peaceful even, but I could not shake a feeling of being watched, as though the forest had eyes that followed me wherever I went. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin, tired and thirsty. I boiled water over the stove, ate some more canned food, and cleaned my boots. The sun was lower now, the sky a deepening orange, and I felt the first stirrings of unease. It was the kind of feeling that comes when silence becomes oppressive, when the stillness feels too complete. I tried to push it aside, telling myself it was just being alone in the wilderness. That night, the wind picked up. It howled through the trees, making them groan and sway. I sat by the fire, listening to the noise outside, feeling my senses sharpen. The darkness pressed against the cabin walls, and every small sound seemed magnified. A branch tapping the roof, the distant howl of a coyote, the snap of twigs near the cabin, it all felt amplified. I checked the locks on the doors and windows several times, each time finding them secure. I told myself I was being paranoid. The second morning brought rain. Heavy, steady rain that drummed against the roof and the porch. The forest seemed to shrink under the sheets of water, the creek swelling and churning. I stayed inside, tending to the fire and reading an old book I had brought. As the hours passed, I noticed something odd. The forest outside the cabin seemed darker than it had been before. The trees, wet and heavy, leaned closer, and the usual chorus of birds and insects was absent. I felt the presence of something shifting just beyond the clearing, though I could see nothing. My heartbeat picked up, and I kept the rifle close, checking it almost obsessively. By late afternoon, I heard it. A loud crack, like a branch breaking, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps on wet leaves. My body tensed. I went to the window and peered out, but the rain was too thick, the forest too dense. Whatever had moved was large, deliberate. The sound came closer, stopping somewhere just beyond the edge of the clearing. I could not see it, but I felt it, a presence watching and waiting. I considered leaving immediately, but the rain made the dirt road treacherous, and I had no idea if I could make it back safely in the dark. Night fell again, darker than before. The forest noises were now replaced by something different. A dragging sound, soft at first, then louder, closer. My imagination tried to fill in the gaps. A wild animal, a deer trapped in the undergrowth, a bear possibly attracted by the fire. I stayed as still as possible, listening, heart pounding. Hours passed, the sound of dragging and footsteps continuing sporadically around the cabin. Sleep was impossible. The third morning came, gray and wet, and I decided I could not wait any longer. I packed my essentials quickly, checked the rifle, and prepared to leave. As I stepped outside, the forest seemed alive with movement. My eyes caught fleeting glimpses of shapes between the trees, dark and swift. I did not pause. I kept my head down, moving toward the dirt road, trying to remember the path I had driven. The rain had softened the ground, making it slippery, but I was careful, moving as fast as I could. Hours later, soaked and exhausted, I finally reached the main road. A car passed, and I waved frantically, relieved when it slowed and stopped. I explained as best as I could, though the driver could see only my shaking hands and pale, wet face. They agreed to give me a ride to the nearest town. By the time I reached safety, I felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. The forest had been unforgiving, overwhelming, and yet nothing supernatural had occurred. It was simply the isolation, the density of the woods, the sound of life moving unseen, and the sharp awareness of my own vulnerability that had made it terrifying. In the following days, I returned to the city, but the memory of the cabin stayed with me. I could not forget the oppressive silence, the feeling of being watched, the relentless rain, and the endless forest. But I also remembered my own ability to survive, to stay calm, to keep moving despite fear. The experience had been terrifying, yes, but it had taught me something valuable. That fear does not always come from monsters or myths, it comes from being truly alone, from being vulnerable, and from facing the raw, indifferent power of nature. The cabin itself I never returned to, but I learned to respect the wilderness in a way I had never done before. Every decision, every movement, every careful step mattered. That trip had been a lesson in patience, vigilance, and endurance. It was scary, intense, and yet, in the end, I had made it through. I survived because I stayed aware, because I listened to the forest without letting panic take over, because I respected the land and its dangers. The memory of fear remained, yes, but it was now tempered with clarity and strength. Even now, months later, I can still picture the cabin in my mind. The dark trees pressing close, the wet moss underfoot, the relentless rain, and the cold, sharp wind that cut through the forest. It is a memory of pure realism, of nature at its rawest, and of the way fear sharpens the mind and tests the body. I never doubted my decision to leave, and I never doubted my own capacity to survive. That cabin trip was more than an adventure. It was a challenge I met and overcame, and the clarity it brought me is something I carry every day.